Okay, good morning, everyone. Please may I ask you to take your seats as the next session is about to begin. Our next session features Tobias Hestler, CFO of Haleon, hosted by Bernstein analyst Bruno Montaigne. And if you'd like to ask questions, you can scan the QR code on the second page of your pamphlet. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming. Tobias, thank you very much for being here with us today. As a little word of a reminder, the QR code, if somebody could please show it on the screen on the back. So please ask questions. It's going to be a lot more fun if you write them in. You can vote on them. It's the easiest way. There we are for the QR code. So, Tobias, thank you again. Now, and by the way, the plan is for the first 35 minutes. I'll be asking questions, but I'll be then making sure they go through as many of your questions as we can from the audience as well. Tobias, since you sort of become an IPO'd company, I would argue probably the 4 to 6% organic growth guidance was the big shock when you first came out of it, probably where you had the biggest credibility gap. It's probably still an outstanding question, probably for longer-term investors, whether that will be the case. So in the beginning, I'll be focusing a little bit on that, on backing up of that. So am I right that the 5, I'll think about 5 as 4 to 6, just to make my numbers a bit easier. Is it fair to think that it's about evenly spread, 2.5 price, 2.5% volume? Is it the right way to think about it?
Yeah, look, so I think, first of all, I mean, I'm really pleased on how the conversation has moved on, right? Because a year ago, 18 months ago, in the conversation, people said, oh my God, GSK forced you to say it, you can never do 4, you know? And why do you even think you can grow 4, right? And I think that's a big debate that happened. And it's very pleasing to see that, 12, 15 months in that journey, or since Capital Markets Day, a bit more than that, the discussion now is around it's not a question about the 4, it's more a question of what does it take for us to do the upper half of that, in the upper half of that range. So that's pleasing, right? So there's progress made. And for us, it's always been, I think, if you sort of go to the pre-COVID and high interest rate environment, it's been about a balance between price and volume, right? And that can be 40-60, 60-40, but I think we've always said a sign of a healthy business is volume and price growth, and we've been able to do both in the past. And I hope that with interest rates and inflation rates coming down a bit, that we're then going back to this longer-term model rather sooner than later. And the other thing to keep in mind is, I think, even through all the craziness of the last 2 years, we've consistently grown volume. So we've continually delivered volume growth. Of course, this year a bit more driven by price, given the environment, and we had to take a bit more price, but we didn't want to push price to a point that we lose volume either.
Yeah. So both price and volume.
Yeah.
Haleon has pricing power, where you look at price elasticity, and I think many people sort of agree on that. But if you have pricing power, you tend to benefit from environments of high CPI. When there's no inflation in the world, it's really hard to have pricing power, right? So therefore, your projection of organic growth, does it assume a certain level of CPI in the broader market? And if we go back to like 2017, 18, 19, there was no CPI anywhere in the developed world. Could that be a drag? So what do you assume for your CPI environment?
So I think we've always taken price, right? I mean, even when there was no CPI growth. And the ability for us to take price is, I think, driven by 3 things. One is it's a high innovation ratio. So where we sell in mass market, which is predominantly in the oral care segment, it's innovation. We bring a high rate of innovation, products with, solving incremental needs. So we add things on top of the shelf and we clean out the bottom of the shelf. So the high innovation rate has allowed us to take price, even in a difficult environment where you deal with, the big retailers of the world. Secondly, I think we're attractive because we deliver a lot of earnings for the retailers because we're playing exclusively on the top of that shelf. And then the other piece is, the mass market channel for us is only a part of our business. It's oral care globally, and it's OTC only in the US, UK, Australia, where you have these mass market channels. But elsewhere, it's actually you go through an ethical channel. You go through pharmacies where you have a very, very different pricing environment. So I think our ability to take price is very much driven by the innovation we have and by the go-to-market model we have. Now, of course, the last year or two, there was a little bit of a honeymoon phase, right? I mean, I think everybody was taking price, and there was sort of this 8 or 9 months window where you were sitting in Walmart, and when you said the word price increase, they didn't throw you out of the room or told you you're going into the penalty box, because they simply couldn't do it because everybody was taking price, and if they wanted to have any type of relationship, they couldn't do it. But that was a 9 months honeymoon phase. That is long over again. I think we're back to sort of the normal price negotiations with those retailers. And I think, look, initially probably it's a bit more price because, I mean, inflation is still there, right? And of course, you have to price up to broadly make up your cost base. But we've done it always in a way not to lose volume, and then hopefully we get back to then this balance over time rather quickly. I mean, for all of us, right? It would be nice if we leave the wobbles behind us.
If I ignore some of the COVID noise and look at your, what's pulling up your organic growth, there's Sensodyne in there, there's Voltaren in there, Parodontax.
Yeah.
Voltaren was an RX to OTC switch, which was last year. So instead of leading brands pulling growth, now Sensodyne is not the youngest of brands, and might be slowing down. Some of the RX to OTC switches only had a few years ago. So to maintain that 5%. Do you need to have an ongoing level of really genuinely new brands like a Voltaren in a few years? What is the level of new categories, brand switches you need to maintain it over a 5 to 10 year basis?
Yeah. So look, I would say, let me maybe take a few brands in isolation here. I think the way we've built our business and building our business tends to be, this is not, these aren't brands where you have a launch and you take a triple digit million advertising number in your hand and you do big advertising and you go out. We've built our business by expert recommendation. So you go to a dentist and you get a recommendation, you get a sample, you test it out, you realize it works, and then we have you because you actually realize your teeth aren't hurting anymore. And then you stick to the product, and then we ensure the product stays relevant for you as a consumer. So these are slower builds. These are where you build the business over a longer period of time, and the products are solving a healthcare need. And then we make sure it stays relevant to you by providing incremental needs. And then there's still penetration opportunity because in Sensodyne, if 45% of the world's population have sensitive teeth, only 30% of those use a sensitivity toothpaste. There's big penetration opportunity still to have, even in a brand that has the size and is already available globally, like a Sensodyne. Then there's geographic expansion opportunity that is there because not all of our brands are in all the markets. So that's clearly a theme. And then I think when you think about a Voltaren, that is, again, a slow build, because on Voltaren, it's a topical pain reliever. So we switched it, the last market we switched it was the US. That was a few years ago. By the way, the first switch was in Germany 20 years ago. So we had a 20-year battle with the FDA to get it switched. So it takes much longer. So it takes about, for us, and to give you a sense of, to get an OTC product rolled out globally, like Voltaren, could take you 10 years, because you have local regulatory bodies everywhere that need to regulate it. If you bring a new Sensodyne innovation, we can probably roll this out in 12 to 18 months everywhere in the world if we want to. Now, Voltaren, you have to convince again the consumer there's a different way to treat your pain. So you hurt your ankle or your muscle. We have to educate you that there's now a product that you can actually put a cream on it, rather than what you've been used to for decades, which is popping a pill. Because in the US, there was no topical pain reliever available that had an active ingredient in it until we launched that. The only thing you could buy in the US was sensorial things, icy hot, menthol, things that heat and cool. But that needs to be educated. So we need to educate the consumer, we need to educate the doctor that something else is available. But again, here it's the same with Sensodyne. We try and get you a sample, you use it, you go home and say, oh, it actually works. And then, once we're there, then we have to make sure the product stays relevant to you. We give you better formulation, a formulation. I mean, 20 years ago when it switched in Germany, it was a sticky cream. Now it's a nice ointment. So there's things you can do, a different pack. We did a double strength formulation, so it's just keeping the product and relevant for you. But ultimately goes back. It solves your bodily need, right?
Tobias, with all your respect, you sort of did talk about all your growth ways, but you didn't really answer whether your growth guidance requires completely new innovations, or actually are you independent of that?
So I think the 4 to 6 in the medium term doesn't, right? I think that is very clear. In the long run, we're working on switches, right? I mean, I think switches have built this industry, right? I mean, if you take a longer term view on it, switches have grown this industry, right? Because Voltaren didn't exist 20 years ago. So yes, switches are in the long run part of that because there are unmet consumer needs where today you can only go to the doctor and get a prescription. So I think that potential, in my view, is there. With technology that exists today, that might unlock certain barriers of switches. While there aren't any obvious switches there in the next few years, that's sort of the easy ones, right? There was a wave of easy switches, and when the allergy products all switched in the 2010 to 2014 period, or the proton pump inhibitors, those were clear they would switch because they had low side effects. They were easy to treat and use, so it was obvious that they would come. Right now, these obvious ones aren't there, but it doesn't mean that there's unmet consumer needs. So absolutely, that's part of it on the longer term strategy, and we're investing in that because ultimately it goes back to unmet consumer needs. Yeah.
You didn't mention the 2 Rx to OTC switches you mentioned in the past. Is that a subtle downplaying it, or are they still actively?
No, so they're active, and we've always said, by the way, our switches, but also the ones that are public from some of our competitors, they all have complexities, right? They're not in this bucket of, I shouldn't say easy. My R&D team would kill me when I say that, right? But I mean, so there aren't these ones that, we're highly likely to switch because they have complexities, because they either have side effects or something, right, that the regulator is concerned about. So that's what we need to work with the FDA. What we said is, that's the reason why they're outside of this 4 to 6 growth guidance, because I can't tell you if they come and when they come. It makes sense to invest in them. If they come, you get a point of growth from it, and then they grow from that at attractive margins. So we're investing in it, but then, the two, we said they're a little bit delayed because we're working with the FDA, but it makes sense, and we keep investing in them. Now, what we've done, we saw that maybe in half year, we licensed in an erectile dysfunction gel for the US. It's not that wasn't available as a prescription product. It's a direct to OTC, but also an FDA approved. So we're looking at new spaces like sexual health, because sexual health is one of those unmet consumer needs where today the treatment options are limited. And I think we see this as a good way to test and work in a new area because it follows our value chain as well.
You mentioned before the international expansion, so I'm thinking Centrum in India, Sensodyne and Parodontax in more countries.
Yeah.
You've been quite clear and vocal about it, but I'm trying to have a ballpark idea about how much is that contributing to organic growth right now. Is it 10 basis points, 50, 100? What's the order of magnitude of that set of mini white space filling in, contributing? And also, are you still doing more and more of it? So is it something that becomes a bigger component of your organic growth than it's been recently or not?
So I think we're doing more of it probably since the Pfizer integration, now that we're an independent company, right? And with some of the money that we're freeing up from our efficiency programs, that's, I think, the prime place where we wanna invest that. And you mentioned some of those examples. I mean, ultimately, these spaces are probably more the emerging markets, because most of the developed markets have the products available. I mean, on Parodontax, there are some developed markets where Parodontax is, but we probably haven't fully activated it, right? So there's some of that. But I think it will predominantly benefit the emerging markets. The emerging markets for us are 34% of our revenue, so I think a good share of that. They've been growing high single to double digit consistently over a long history. I mean, over the history that is public, but also if I look back at the prior companies, and it's a pretty broad-based footprint as well. So I think a big part of that growth that is significantly ahead of the 4 to 6 that is in the medium-term guidance, comes from these emerging markets, and it comes from geographic expansion in those. But we haven't split out exactly what that is. And just to give you maybe one or two other data points. I mean, when you think about India, 80% of our revenue are 2 brands there. Or Middle East Africa, 3 brands make up about 60-ish% of our revenue. So there is potential there to bring more brands into those markets and making the right investment and build on those over time, because we truly believe in the growth potential of these markets. And look, and Centrum is a good one. It was a test case, right? Because there was this debate around, is the Indian consumer ready for, a Western, typical US type Centrum product, right? And I think doing that, of course, on Amazon is a great test case, because you immediately see, you get immediate feedback, and it landed very well. Very good, positive brand recognition, clearly a consumer base that's ready to spend on that. So I think that convinced us and gave us the data point that it makes sense to launch it, and to launch it in brick and mortar, right? So I think you can do it in a bit of a test-wise learning, and then you start, of course, in a limited area, and you build out from there.
Now, I'd like to move on to A&P.
Yeah. I
mean, 18.7%, I think the latest A&P ratio was, which looks healthy as a CPG company. That's clearly down. I think you were at 20% higher before. I can see some short-term reason why it would be a bit lower. If you're running out of flu product or paint products, why would you advertising? But should we expect it to go back to above 20% and above in the quite near future? And would you also want it to be an ever-increasing kind of A&P path as percentage of sales?
Yeah, so look, maybe approach it from 2 different angles. So clearly, we want to keep investing, and the money we free up into consumer-facing advertising, or the consumer-facing advertising and promotion activity. So that's the piece that should increase. And we've given that number at year-end last year. We've given that the half year, so that our consumer-facing advertising went up by 8%, which I think is a very healthy investment in the overall environment. And that's for me sort of the ultimate measure around, do I put more advertising in front of the consumer where it triggers activity. Now, if you look at the total A&P, there's a few other components in that bucket. There's the consumer-facing advertising that, and by the way, the accounting definitions that we have and competitors have are slightly different, right? So let me maybe explain to you what's in this A&P bucket. So you have the consumer-facing that should go up. That should increase over time, because that's how we drive growth. That's how we drive activity, both on the digital side or in traditional media. Then you have the non-consumer-facing one, which is the cost you create internally and with your agencies to create the advertising. That's a bucket that I would expect to stay stable, ideally decrease, as we drive efficiencies, that we work with different agencies, we offshore activities, we use more digital tools to create it, and we've had good success in negotiating and reducing that non-working or non-consumer facing part of the A. Then you have promotion in there. For us, promotion is one that we want to do as little as we can to keep the retailers happy. Now, you don't do promotion in pharmacy channel anyway, but in the mass market channel, you have to do a certain amount. Otherwise, a Boots, a Tesco, a Walmart isn't going to work with you. So we want to do as little as possible on the P side, because we don't want to sell our products on, always on promotion. So you would expect that shouldn't grow ahead of the rate of sales growth, maybe stable, but so you have a big component in there. And then also what's in our A&P is the expert field forces, so where we go and see the dentist. So the dental recommendation, because we see this as promotion, right? It's not a classic selling where I have the selling relationship. So we put this into our A&P bucket. That is more a stepwise function. If you enter a new market like India, you're building such a field force, but then once you've built it, it's pretty stable. Sure, it grows maybe with inflation, but not more than that. So you have, quite a few components that won't grow at the same ratio. So ultimately, consumer-facing should go up. That's where we want to invest. And then the other piece is, I think, when you look at the overall ratio, of course, the A we allocate to the growth brands are significantly higher, right? They're a factor higher than others. There's a number of brands that, are part of a base portfolio that a pharmacist has, where you do very little advertising. So the question for me is then the other element of, are we disproportionately pumping money into the growth drivers that are Sensodyne, the Parodontax, and so on as well?
Now, part of the pitch when you IPO'd was that as an independent company, you could be more commercial. You know,
Yeah.
you're part of a pharma company.
Yeah.
You pride yourself in a board that has huge amount of consumer background in there. Can you give any tangible data points of what that really means and how it's been different, this independence and this stronger commercial approach, and what you could do before?
Yeah, so I think there's clearly quite a bit of red tape that has already disappeared. Yeah? So, let me give you an example. Sort of pharma red tape was that in the pharmaceutical industry, a pharmacist is a so-called healthcare professional. So that means documentation requirements. So every pharmacy visit we had to be documented. There was a 25-page manual and I don't know how many pages the report had, that every sales rep that went to a pharmacy needed to fill in. Because that is pharmaceutical regulation, because they're considered a healthcare professional. For us, they're a customer. We're selling to the pharmacist. So I have a commercial relationship with the pharmacist. They are not a healthcare professional that recommends your product, and it's a very different thing. So we slimmed that down. It's now 2 pages. There aren't these, documentation requirements anymore, which frees up Salesforce time, and you can be faster, right? There is things like regular approval processes of claims, which were sitting in the center in GSK. So when you had certain claims, they needed to be reviewed very, very high up, which is the right process for a pharma company, but not. So we pushed this down. We created a database. If it's in line within the database, there aren't any approval steps the country can do those things. So I think these are things that sort of were quick, and we could do those quickly out of the gate. And then there's other pieces where, of course, we've inherited shared services infrastructure from our pharma parents, which is in the case of systems, IT, finance, HR, where you carry the history and you run processes, because the SAP system was programmed to cover everything that GSK had. So now it's our own system. Now we can start implementing that and doing things more automated, right? I think there were rules programmed in the system that every order that came in needed to be manual checked. So in our business, you don't need that, right? I think there was, but these were, group-wide rules that I couldn't influence in the consumer business. I tried at some point. Sometimes you won, sometimes you gave up at some point. That's now under our control, and I think these things are happening, right? And then the last thing I would say is, look, there is a board now that is entirely made up of a wide range of consumer experts, where you get very different input. It's a little bit like, a world-class consulting advisory team that sits around that, at the board meetings, outside the board meeting, that I can pick up the phone, I can get guidance, I can get input, which I think was much more limited before in both of the pharma companies I was part of. Yeah.
Last question on A&P. I'm trying to understand the role of A&P in your particular product category. On the one hand, you have very low price elasticity. Basically, volumes don't move when prices change, which is good. But isn't the flip side of that is that trying to drive more demand by advertising is a lot harder? You can't both be resilient and be able to easily, actively. So what is the role then? If you are that resilient, what does the A&P really do for you, contrary to a L'Oreal, where you can always drive an extra consumption?
I think the advertising, the role the advertising plays for us is making sure that we remind you of the product, that it's still there, and we remind you of any improvements or changes we've made to the product. So let's take the Sensodyne example. So usually when you're at the dentist and the dentist tells you, oh, you have sensitive teeth, they give you a sample, that is a base Sensodyne. That just solves your sensitivity. There's nothing else in it. And then assume you say it works, you start buying the product. You probably buy the base Sensodyne. And then we want to take you on a life journey of Sensodyne, because you have it all your life, right? So sorry for the ones here. If you have sensitive teeth, you'll have it for life, yeah? But I have to make sure this product stays relevant for life. So you might be someone that smokes and drinks a lot of tea. You have a whitening need. So it's Sensodyne plus whitening. you have very heavy, you have a very strong sensitivity. You want speed. So there is a speed formulation that you say, before I eat an ice cream, I brush my teeth, so I'm really sure it happens. So that's your need. Animal repair. So I give you additional benefits depending where you are sort of in your lifestyle and in your curve. And the role of advertising is because that's not the role of the dentist. The dentist is not going to tell you there is a speed formulation. That's the role of advertising, to bring it in front of you and say there is something, and also then to bring you back in front of the shelf where you make that purchase decision, or online, or wherever you're gonna buy it, right? So it's keeping the product relevant to you, right? I mean, another example, take Tums, right? It's been around since the 1930s and 40s. It's chalk. You're not going to get it, the doctor maybe tells you sort of, yeah, that's the first thing you do. But keeping that product relevant to the consumer is important. And we bring you in to say, we've done a new formulation. It has now, it has different taste. It has a different form. It's not the form that your grandparents took or your parents took. And then keep it relevant to you. Or now, I mean, bringing more consumer insight into that. So on Tums, the consumer need is, you want to sleep through the night. The consumer need is not, I don't want to have heartburn, or I don't want the acid reflux, which is the technical description. So what we've done now is, in addition to the chalk, we did a product in the US to put melatonin in it, because melatonin helps you sleep through the night. So we're solving your consumer need of, I want to sleep through the night, and solving it through two ingredients, which is the chalk against your acid reflux, but also the melatonin, which helps you sleep through the night. And that's sort of a consumer insight. And that you advertise, and with that you come back in front of the shelf, right? And it's a slower build, right? This is not, as I said before, right? It's not the 50, 100 million and you get a kicker. That is not how this business model works, yeah?
Moving on to something you love talking about, I think, FX and FX rates. I know it's been very painful at the beginning, but let me first think about your transactional effects, the manufacturing in Switzerland. I can see why you're there. It improves your tax rate, so no problem with that. But sort of, most investors would probably expect that the Swiss franc's appreciation is not something that's over. It's a strong currency. So are you effectively, by manufacturing so much in Switzerland, are you creating a persistent cost drag that will get ever more expensive and putting yourself at a competitive disadvantage, above and beyond the tax benefit you have now?
So look, I think there's the short-term stuff, right? The short-term stuff you can solve with hedging and so on, but that's a very short-term. What you're asking is sort of what are the longer-term things? And I think that's part of the manufacturing network considerations, right? That, on a regular basis, we look at, is the network in the right place, and are there alternatives for that? In Switzerland so far, I think each time we looked at it, the case was better to stay in Switzerland, because what we make in Switzerland is Voltaren and Otrivin, high-speed lines. It's a very well-invested factory. It's approved by, I think, 50-plus regulatory bodies in the world. And the team so far was able, through efficiencies that they drive, to make this a better case than taking, probably a 3-digit million investment number in your hand to build a factory elsewhere. Because this is highly specialized manufacturing. It's spray formulations, and it's semi-solid, so creams and ointments. Nobody has these capabilities. There is no contract manufacturing capability. So our alternative would be go somewhere else and build a new factory from the ground up. And that case has never meshed. And then the other one is, of course, it gives me a bigger presence in the market, sort of more justification for a good part of my taxes to be payable in Switzerland. And that's something we would look at over time from a sort of manufacturing footprint point of view. The same is, in China, it's great already, because 85 to 90% of what we sell in China, we make in China. There's a little bit of stuff you have to import. A lot of the emerging markets have factories, but there's always a bit of an element of you can't buy certain pharmaceutical ingredients in Argentina or in Brazil or in South Africa that you have to import. So there is a way with strategic decisions on manufacturing to involve it over a longer period of time if you have the scale. Yeah. So.
Now, Switzerland is very much a transactional effect, and we've had a few quarters discussion about that. Last time we also started talking about translational effects.
Yeah.
Now, I would have at first instance assumed that it should be random noise. You get good quarters or bad half years. Is there any reason to suspect that your translational effects could have a persistent drag, that it could be, it's not just a one-off?
So look, I mean, if the sterling appreciates against 40 or 45 trading currencies, then it's persistent in either direction, right? I mean, the last few weeks it's gone the other direction again. But I think it was, I mean, ultimately something it's very hard to or impossible to plan for, and I can't, right? So, but it's very unusual that, sterling moves against 40 out of 45, and we're seeing it a bit coming back. So I think you would see movement in both directions, right? Now, I mean, of course, then we had, the disaster a year ago in the UK with the mini budget, and then followed by, of course, very different interest rate decisions that were taken that have propelled the sterling. So I think this is something entirely out of our control, right? What's in my control and what we're driving for is what I explained earlier, to say, where does my cost base sit, and that's what I can influence, yeah? And then there's always a little bit of translational exposure as well from the emerging market footprint, because these things aren't 100% aligned. Where we've done quite a bit of work is to align the cost of our debt with the cost of our earnings. So our debt is taken in dollar, in euros, in Chinese renminbi, and a bit in pound, because that's sort of where we know that the cash flows are coming in as well. So you don't sort of, from a leverage point of view, over time, you get a broad balance on that.
Based on our previous conversation and talks around the IPO, I would have expected more infill M&A. I mean, even remember you saying your leverage target was achievable with a certain amount of infill M&A. So there always seemed to be some planning for it.
Yeah.
We're not seeing much. Is it harder to get them? What's explaining that?
No, look, it's scarcity of assets, right? I mean, I think we've always said this is not an. If I give you the list of M&A deals that were done in this industry, it's over the last few years, it's 2 pages, and the pages aren't in a 6 font print. They're in probably a 12 size font, right? So there aren't that many things. So we looked at a few, but the ones we saw weren't attractive. They weren't the ones where we said we can make a significant difference to the brand. So I think it's scarcity of asset, simply as that. I would have loved to do it. It's not that I said no to anything. I said it just wasn't the right assets that were there that made sense to us. So, and the way we had set the deleverage guidance was we want to have the ability to do something. So we delevered a bit faster because there wasn't one so far, but we keep looking. But I would say, look, I don't expect this being suddenly a highly acquisitive industry, because it never has been. And look, these are attractive brands. It's very hard for people giving up those brands as well.
If there aren't that many new deals, acquisitions, I did pick up some reporting about the potential to sell some businesses, whether it's Nicotinell or Chapstick. Should investors expect you to be a net kind of disposing company in the next few years, rather than a net acquisitive company across the whole mix?
So look, I mean, acquisitive, I would love to, right? So, and sometimes you're lucky that for whatever reason things come to market, and then you want to have the ability to do those. That's one thing. On the divestment side, I think, look, we're a company with 100 brands. What you would expect me to do, and which we're doing, is we look at those brands and see, do they still create the right shareholder value? So the most recent example, we divested Lamisil. Athlete's foot treatment, 50-ish million in revenue. We're able to divest it at a very nice multiple, 4.7 times revenue. And that was one where we were able to have, a competitive situation of a few companies that had a platform, they could slot it in. And I got a deal value that is bigger than my keep valuation. So if I model forward, what can I do with this brand? We feel we couldn't grow it much more. Tried a long time, by the way. Brian and I have known it for, from the Novartis days. We tried a lot with making it a growth brand. We never, and the brand is spread across, I don't know, it's available in 50 markets, right? And the deal I got is more than what my forward projection is from an NPV point of view. So by divesting it, I create shareholder value because I get more money, and I simplify my portfolio, and I get a bit of cash. If that equation works, I divest, right? So I need a good reason. It's either shareholder value creative or another big reason why I would do that. And if the bids I would have gotten wouldn't have met that criteria, and we tried to divest other brands, And we haven't, because why would I destroy shareholder value? Because then I know externally what the market is willing to bid. Then I can tell my internal teams, if you're above that line, you're creating shareholder value, because that's what I can divest it for. By the way, Lamisil, we tried 3 years ago, or 2 years ago, and we didn't divest, because the value was much lower. I kept it. I got now much more for it. Now it made sense to divest it. And that's how how we're dealing with those things. So it's absolutely unpredictable whether you can divest or not. But, I mean, in this one, it made a lot of sense. Yeah.
I'll go to my last question, and so for the audience, if you haven't posted your questions yet, so please a reminder, use the QR code to get in there. Now, so back to divesting, the cash you generate is well on track for the leverage target. You've already brought it forward from end of next year to middle of next year. I think you might hit it before the end of this year, the below 3. Now, this kind of cash generation and your position leverage, does it give you more appetite to participate in share buybacks when Pfizer and GSK parts become on the market?
Yeah, so look, I mean, if you think about the capital allocation priorities we set, it was one, invest in the business. CapEx is very healthy. There is a bit of working capital that we can free up. So I think that's very stable. So no worries on that. And you've seen us doing that. And then priority number 2 was the deleveraging. We're very much on that path, which is great. And then third is then look at bolt-on M&A. We just talked that. Nothing available now, but I want to have the ability to do that. And then ultimately, there comes a point when there's excess cash, right? Because, and then we have to deal with, once I deleverage to less than 3, where we're going to say, what are we doing with the cash that is there? And at that point, then, we have to say, is it better to keep delevering? If I would have the excess cash today, delevering, paying down more debt that costs me 3 or 3.2% on average probably doesn't have a big return, yeah? Then we can look at share buybacks and dividends. So right now, the biggest probably shareholder value creation would be, assuming there's no bolt-on M&A opportunity, would be to do a share buyback, and then maybe from our 2 shareholders at a discount. Yeah? If I could do that, yeah? That would create the biggest shareholder return, followed by a share buyback, followed by a higher dividend. And ultimately, this allows me to sort of play the full TSR menu, because right now our hands are bound given the leverage we have, so I can't order from the full menu. I can't do the other drivers of TSR that all of the wider peer set is doing. And I think that window will open up in the not too distant future, just given the high cash generative nature of that business. And look, I mean, that's a very good and positive outlook to have. And then we'll sit down with the board at that time and look at all those elements. And, of course, we'll update then also our capital allocation priorities, because once we're below 3, then, of course, that deleverage to below 3 has to be adapted. And I think we'll do that, in due course when we get there.
Thanks for the question. There's one very popular question with loads of votes. Yeah. A concern for a lot of investors in the CPG space is private label threat, especially as we were squeezing consumer budgets.
Yeah.
How do you assess the threat of private label across your markets and products?
Okay. So let me start with where private label exists. So private label exists only in a mass market environment. So you have the US, you have US, Canada, UK, Australia, where the big mass market retailers exist. And it only exists in over-the-counter to a very limited amount in vitamins, mineral supplements. It does not exist in oral care. So when you look at our overall business, so, 30% is oral care, no private label, doesn't exist. Then it's over-the-counter medicines, 55% of our business, but of that, only the pieces that are in the US, the UK, and Australia. So much smaller part of that business. In the US, where you have the perfect data, private label share in our categories is 25%, and it's been 25% forever. So in the last year, no change. On the contrary, actually, private label share went down. We thought it's going to slightly up. In the financial crisis, private label share moved from 25 to 26, came back down to 25. Every new product that comes to market gets about a quarter share in private label over the last 2 decades. So it's flat like a pancake, and it hasn't changed, even in economic times. And I think that there's 2 reasons for that. And so it's my theory. We don't have sort of the research to prove it, but I think the way I see this is 2 reasons. One is I think there is a certain segment of consumer that is predominantly price conscious, and that number of consumer doesn't change. And that's the consumer that actually takes the time to turn around the label, say what's in it, and is predominantly driven by, I want to buy the cheapest product. And they have the ability to go to private label, to a club channel, and to online. And those are the channels they're using, and they've consistently been using. And we've not seen a change in that happening. The second reason is we're dealing with healthcare products. We're dealing with trusted brands. So when you're sick, you have a headache, you have a running nose, something aches, something sneezes, you go back to what you trust and what you know, because you want that problem solved now. Or your wife calls you and say the child is sick, you probably bring back home what your wife tells you to bring home, and not the other stuff that because it was $0.50 or $1 cheaper. Yeah? So, or if I have a cold and flu, I go back to what my mom gave me, right? I mean, I think it's these sort of, you have to trust in the brand because you deal with your own health, and that make these brands, I think, much more sticky and less exposed to. And the last point is, they're not in your daily or weekly or monthly shopping basket. You have a cold and flu once or twice a year. If you have kids in kindergarten, maybe a bit more often. You have an allergy, maybe once a year, maybe twice a year. So you don't buy those regularly either, right? So I think that the shopping decisions are a little bit different. So in short, not concerned about private label. We're tracking it. We were very worried about the environment in the last year, but we've not seen any moves in that.
A word on Zantac and potential liability?
So look, we said a year ago we think Haleon is not liable, so nothing has changed on that. In the meantime, the primary litigations have moved on. They've moved on, I think, positively. Now we're not part of that primary litigation. We get to see the outputs of that. So I think that side is moving positively. If there would be any exposure, it would be along a liability change through 5 or 6 corporate transactions. So I think, Zantac not a topic for us. The other liability we had was the PPI litigations. We settled those in about end of last year for de minimis amounts. I think this is a part of, I would say, the risk exposure on litigation is relatively low. It's an over-the-counter medicine. These products have been on the market 20 plus years. In order to sell them over-the-counter, there's a very intense regulatory process. Like I told you, it took us 20 years to get Voltaren switched in the US, right? The regulators are really, really risk averse because they want to avoid that you as a consumer are in front of shelf and buy something that isn't good to you. So the duty we of course have is we have to keep the products updated. If there's new science, you have to update them and reformulate the product. You might have to remove ingredients and all that. And if we do that, then I think the risk exposure should be smaller. Now, in a US environment, there could always be cases, but what I'm used to is that you have a case, but then you might at some point just settle it because it's easier to settle it than make, law firms rich and trying to fight it through for several years. Yeah.
Does the FDA's recent decision about pulling a commonly used OTC decongestant affect your business, either through any US sales or through the potential for it getting pulled in other markets?
Yeah, so let me first of all, the FDA has not made a decision, right? So there was an advisory committee of 13 experts that have said that they believe that PE, so phenylephrine, which is the nasal decongestion, they think it's not effective. So it's not a safety topic, it's a question about effectiveness, and it's a question about effectiveness as an oral product, not as a spray and as a nasal spray. So it's so now the FDA has to review that. Now, PE is part of the monograph in the US. So that's a list of, it's a book that says which are the products that are considered generally effective and safe, and everything that's on that list you can sell over the counter in the US. So the FDA has to now take a decision whether there's no worry about safety, so there's no immediate thing. It's about the question on the effectiveness. So they have to make a decision what they do. Do they take the ingredient off? Do they change the label? Or what they do? And that is a process now that they will start in time. They don't have a clock to do that, but that will probably happen over the next few months. Then they will form a recommendation. Then they work with the industry. So there's a time frame of doing that. And then that means, I think, for the industry, then the question of could be a label change. It could be reformulating the products. The problem is that oral medication, there's another one, PSE, but that was moved behind the counter because the U.S. was worried about this being abused for, making meth. So you have to go to the counter in the U.S., so that means there's nothing else available. Now, for us, we don't have any pure PE product. For us, it is Theraflu plus a nasal decongestion. It's Robitussin with a nasal decongestion. The consumers still have nasal decongestion, so they're looking for solutions. So solutions could be opportunity for more nasal sprays, or putting other ingredients in the products, reformulating that, and that should be a process over time. So we have to see how that evolves. It's, by the way, something that's very usual, right? I mean, I think ingredients, you learn new stuff about ingredients because science evolves. And when you know about that, then you start working on that, either proactively or, in this case, I think the industry has a very different view than this panel, where you actually start changing the product over time, right? And by the way, the same happens in cosmetics and other places. So that's our duty to keep the products fresh. And we'll keep you updated on what happens with the FDA. And then, look, I mean, overall, it's globally less than 4% of our revenue. In the U.S., it's significantly less than 2%. And as I said, it's not, if it disappears from the industry, but people will seek alternative treatments as well because you still have nasal decongestion and you're still going to get a cold and flu as well. So we have to work through that.
With that, we're done, Tobias. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks for your interest. Thank you very much.